I am Augusta DeLomo, here with my colleague Brian Franklin. Today is October 29th, 2023, and we are in New York City. We are interviewing Jim Siekmeier. Jim, could you introduce yourself to us?
Yes, I'm Jim Siekmeier. I went to Cornell from 1986 to 1992. I worked various different jobs in academia and government, and now I teach at West Virginia University.
Great, and could you start us off with how you met Walt LaFeber?
Yeah, I met him actually at a talk. I was working in Cleveland for the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland as a research assistant. I thought I wanted to go into economics, but I decided not to go into economics. He gave a talk at Case Western Reserve University, and I had read one of his articles in college, so I knew that he was a big name. And my advisor, where I went to college, had told me about him and told me that he was going to give a talk at Case Western, which my advisor knew that I lived. My former advisor knew that I lived near Case Western. So I went to the talk, and it was 1985, the fall of 1985, and it was quite a remarkable experience. Once I heard that talk, I was thinking about going to graduate school in history already before he gave the talk, but then I decided that I would go to grad school in history. So, because it was so enlightening, it was fascinating, it was so relevant. He had just written a book, Inevitable Revolutions, United States and Central America, which is a historical perspective on U.S. intervention in Central America. I was interested in U.S.-Latin American relations as well. And so I bought his book, I read his book, and I decided to go to grad school and applied to a number of different places, of course, to see where I got accepted, and I got accepted to Cornell. So I decided to go to Cornell, not knowing if I would study with him or not, but I figured he would at least be nearby in the department. And I ended up being his student, and the rest is history, as I say. So.
Can you talk us through some of the most important or memorable interactions you had with him while you were a graduate student?
Right, yeah. Well, maybe it's a truism. You probably heard this from a number of his other students who went into academia in particular. He was someone who was great at so many things. He was a great mentor. He was a great teacher. He was a great researcher. He was a great writer. And so, just watching him lecture was quite an experience, but also watching him give me comments on my papers was very, very important to me because he was great at mentoring. But also he was just a warm and wonderful human being. It was like, how could someone be so good at so many things and be such a nice person at the same time? It was remarkable for the 6 years that I was there, and also in the time I spent with him after that as well. So.
When you started working on your own research in graduate school and he started giving you feedback, what kind of feedback did you get from him?
The great thing about Professor LaFeber was that he could give you great feedback on the research and on the writing both. So it was basically, this is the type of research you need to do. You have to be rigorous. Your writing has to be organized. It has to be clear. So it was all different sorts of feedback, which he was sort of equally good at giving, which was very remarkable. And the other thing which astounds people who are in graduate school or in academia is like your professor, you give them a chapter dissertation, and sometimes you wait like a few weeks or months. He would get it back to you in like 2 or 3 days, and it would have brilliant comments on it. It's like, how can you get it back so quickly? And also, it's got really relevant and important comments. So,
we've heard a lot about him as a teacher of undergraduates, and could you talk to us a little bit about not only what you saw when he taught undergraduates, but also what you experienced in his teaching when you were a graduate student, if that felt similar or different?
That's a really good question because he was known. I got there in 1986, so he'd been teaching there for 25 odd years, and so he already had this really remarkable record as an undergraduate teacher. And I could tell just talking to the undergraduates. Some of them said, "Oh, the reason I came to Cornell is my parents took a class with him." So they said, "We'll pay for your Cornell tuition if you take a course with LaFeber." So, but with graduate students, he was equally good. I don't really know how else to put it. He was someone who was always available and was always willing to give you good, rigorous, and excellent feedback. and also was someone who was very good at helping you navigate the job market, the job interview process. As I didn't know much about how that was going to work or how it worked at all, and he educated me in that regard as well.
So you finish up at Cornell, and where do you go next?
Oh, I went to Cornell's Washington program, and that was great because I got to teach, some really, really excellent students at their branch campus in Washington, D.C., but then I finished up the research for my first book, and then after that I taught at a small college in Iowa. I got a Fulbright to Bolivia and taught in Spanish, North American history in La Paz, Bolivia. I came back to the United States and worked in West Texas, taught Latin American and U.S. history there. I got another grant to go to Bolivia, so I didn't want to pass that up, and I went back to work in my second book there, I guess you would say. Then I came back to the United States again, worked for the Office of the Historian, doing foreign relations in the United States, official diplomatic history of American foreign relations. And I learned a lot about the inner workings of American foreign relations, and had great colleagues. Also was one of the first time I think I actually was working in something I was trained to do, because I got my doctorate in U.S. diplomatic history, but because of the nature of the job market, looking for jobs, I had two fields in Latin American history, Latin American studies. So I taught Latin American history, those previous jobs I talked about. So I actually got to do, foreign relations stuff, my training, which was very nice. And then I got a position at West Virginia University.
Can you talk us through how in each of these different roles you saw yourself pulling on things that you learned from LaFeber, whether it's research, how you wrote, how you approach teaching or mentorship?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Because basically I learned from Professor LaFeber how to be a great mentor and teacher, and somehow juggle doing research and writing at the same time. And at each of these positions, LaFeber is always someone who said, or at least I inferred this, implied this, you have to spend time in research and teaching. You don't short shrift one for the other, and they're mutually compatible and reinforcing. So I tried to sort of have some sort of work-life balance, like he did, I guess. So that was the main thing, and also just his focus on undergraduate teaching. Because even though I was a grad student at Cornell, I saw how he was a very effective undergraduate teacher, and so therefore I learned from the master, and I tried to be like him as much as I could. Also, sort of parenthetically and kind of humorously too, I remember he told me early on in my graduate career at Cornell, don't get involved in campus politics. Just focus on teaching and do your research and writing. And I tried to adhere that as much as possible. Unfortunately, I tend to get pulled in. And so that, and now ironically, after he's passed away, I'm involved in university politics. Maybe because I can get away with it now. Because he's not going to tell me, what are you doing? And which I don't really like. So he was right. I got involved in it. I don't really like it. But that was something too, is like, which was an important message. Focus on your teaching, focus on your writing and research. That's what's key and important.
We've heard a lot about the magical undergraduate lectures with the 50 minutes on the dot, no notes. Yeah. So are you emulating that, or what are the things that you're drawing?
I certainly use notes, I try to be as clear as possible and well organized as possible. I liked LaFeber's laid-back lecture style, and I try to emulate that as well, because sometimes my lecture style gets to be too enthusiastic or histrionic, and I try to think more, like how would Walt give this talk, more laid back and more conversational. I think the main point is, I guess I already said, it's that his lectures are very clear. Oftentimes, diplomats speak in this vague language. He cuts right to the core. It's like, you're not going to write like that. You're not going to speak like that in my classes. So I realized that, to be an effective teacher, you have to be clear and well organized. And he was a master at that. I'm still trying to reach that level, but it's a guiding star for for my approach to lecturing and teaching, I guess. So.
Obviously, he was a traditional diplomatic historian,
right, yes,
in many ways, and you talked about that you started teaching in Latin American studies.
Right.
Were there ideas and themes that you drew on from his research as you were teaching those courses?
Yeah, what I thought was actually great about my career, and I didn't really think of it this way, is that he was very U.S.-centric in his teaching of U.S. diplomatic history, which is typical of his generation. And so, but then I got jobs doing Latin American history, so I automatically sort of decentered things because I was teaching Latin American and American history. These are small colleges, small universities, so I taught lots of different things. So my approach is more vague and decentered, but actually LaFeber has been so important because I realize now, like, his U.S.-centric focus kept things organized and clear for the students. And then when I first started my career, I tried to be, let's talk about what's going on in the U.S., let's talk about what's going on overseas, and let's talk about both. And then the students were getting confused. So I was like, okay, I got to be more focused. Like, well, I have to make a decision, make an argument from the beginning, clearly outline what I'm going to do, and that's the best way to teach. So.
How would you see and talk about his contribution to the field of U.S. foreign relations, and how do you think he saw it?
That's a very good point, a very good question. His contribution to the field, when he first started in 1959, he really had to bring economics into the conversation, and to some degree culture. The cultural turn was in the 1980s, 1990s, but he really was bringing in culture in some ways even before that. So that was his major contribution, but also to be a critic of American foreign relations, because during that time period, in his early career at least, because of the Cold War consensus, you didn't criticize U.S. foreign relations because people might think you were a dangerous radical or worse, right? And so he's like, well, I don't care what people think. In that regard, I'm going to do what I think is important because it's important to think otherwise. The title of this event. So I think that was his main contribution, but also his contribution was in the area of teaching. He taught so many students at Cornell who went on to work in government and in business. So that was sort of the two-pronged approach. The way he saw his contribution was basically to cause the students to think about U.S. foreign relations in more complex and interesting ways. When he started teaching a sort of realist framework of just looking at power politics, diplomatic negotiations, and military, political side of U.S. foreign relations. That's all that happened. So I think he wanted to bring other things into the mix to show that U.S. foreign relations had a multi-causal, foundation.
I've been very struck by during the conference and then reading the volume before just how many different things he wrote on. He's crossing geographies and time spans. First, how do you think he did that? And second, what are the intellectual questions that you saw that you can trace through all of the books? Right, yeah.
So it was really remarkable how he did try out different parts of the world, because too often people just focus on, and I do this, just focus on one part of the world, because you learn that language and you sort of work within that sort of little part of the sandbox, I guess I could say. I think that he was moved to work in different parts of the world because he wanted to see these connections across geographic area and across time. And that's, looking at the entire sort of body of his work, that's really, thinking about it this weekend, that's one of his really important contributions, is that he did manage to see these common themes. And so one common theme is, of course, the rise and fall of U.S. power, the rise and fall of presidential power, also the importance of U.S. Cultural imperialism, if you will, but also to point out key differences as well. I mean, so if he's looking at U.S. Latin America and looking at Japan, he's not going to use the same approach. I mean, he really did get into the innards of what's going on in Central America or in Japan, and so that caused him to write a book that was very different, and so then foreign policy becomes very complicated and complex and hard to understand. But that's okay. That's the way it is. So I saw that complexity by reading his different books over the years. So
the field of diplomatic history has changed a lot. I mean, now we have U.S. in the world and international history. And what elements of that do you think that he really responded to intellectually? And do you think that he had questions about some of the new directions the field has gone?
Right. Yeah, that's a very good question, because in some ways he did address, I don't want to say embrace, like the cultural turn, international history, transnational history. But in other ways he sort of stuck to his traditional sort of U.S.-focused approach. And I guess one of the many remarkable things about him is that he managed to do both of those things. He sort of stayed true to his sort of U.S.-centric roots. Maybe he wouldn't want to use the term U.S.-centric, but it's a U.S.-focused roots. But yet he did bring in elements of culture. And he thought it was important to bring in issues, especially of race and gender and culture. But I know in the introduction of one of his books, the Michael Jordan and the New Global Capitalism book, he was very critical of people in the field of diplomatic history that focus, just on culture, just on the cultural turn, and not enough on power and the use of power and the abuse of power. So I think ultimately one of his many goals in writing all of his books is to focus on the abuse of power and how corrosive and how dangerous and how damaging that can be. And so he didn't want the field to lose focus on that. But also I think I know, because talking to him, and it's in the introduction to that book, Michael Jordan, The New Global Capitalism, he understood that, after the Cold War ended and the communist world, dissolved, collapsed, there was going to be an element of Cold War triumphalism. It's bad, it's not good, but I mean, it's hard to, with such a great victory, how are you going to avoid it? And so I think he understood that, there was going to be this shift away from looking at, the abuse of U.S. power or the abuse of power in general, and this reveling in, we have this new world order of neoliberal economic exchange and peace and prosperity. It's like, that's not the case. In fact, I even remember him. I was in grad school when the Cold War ended, and he was very prescient. It was ominous. He said, he started out his lecture on the end of the Cold War by saying, all right, I realize, people think there's this whole new world of the end of history, right? And then he went on to talk about how that's not true in a very compelling and convincing way, which even, if I did have my notes from then, which I don't, but I could probably, because I remember enough of the lecture, I probably could reconstruct that lecture and give it today. It's still relevant 32 years later or whatever. I mean, it's remarkable. So,
which of his works do you think most influenced you in the way you're thinking, or maybe the one that, is your favorite?
Right. Now, that's a very good question. The book that really got me to decide definitely that I'm going to do U.S. diplomatic history was the book Inevitable Revolutions. And like I said, I didn't know if I'd get into Cornell, but I was certainly going to apply there. So that book is a great book of public intellectual history, scholar activism, or public intellectual history. Yeah, he's trying to influence the policy debate, but yet it's also a rigorous scholarly work. It's also very well written. It contributed to the academic literature on U.S. Central American relations in really important ways. But it was really written to sort of educate the interested public and policymakers to try and get them to see the historical underpinnings of the problems and danger of U.S. foreign relations with Central America going all the way back to the 19th century. So, throughout my career, I've wanted to write such a book. I haven't yet, but I'm still gonna. There's still time. And so I want to write a book that's a crossover book as well, that's written for the educated public and policymakers, but also contributes to the field. So.
You mentioned him as kind of a scholar activist, and some of the participants here have said that he would not have loved that term.
Right, yeah.
Other people have said that's the term that makes sense. Where do you fall on it?
Yeah, well, I say exactly that, is that he would not have liked that term, but he probably would have embraced the term public intellectual. I think I never actually asked him if he considered himself that. I just sort of assumed that he was that. because a lot of his books were written in a way that, an accessible way that even if they're academic books, that you would still see them in bookstores, and the educated people educated public would buy them. So I think he would not like the term activist, because I think he would see that as having an axe to grind and having a point of view not backed up by rigorous scholarly evidence. And he was very all about making sure you had a good argument and backing it up. And you could still be an activist and do that, and he probably would say that's true, but he still thought the term activist, I think he would have thought the term activist was something that would detract from being a serious, rigorous, dispassionate, objective scholar. So,
could you talk us through some of his public intellectual work, some of the things that we've heard about? Obviously, his public writings, his talks, his work with declassification, or maybe some things that we don't know. Right.
No, that's a very good question. The public intellectual material. I mean, I think he clearly saw that as important. I mean, in some ways, I get a sense that he would have liked to have stayed in the ivory tower and just done his teaching and research, and certainly a lot of people do that, and he would have been great at that and happy at that, but he sort of felt an obligation. Part of it's kind of the progressive school of American history, in which it's important to get the public to see how elites in the country are perhaps abusing their power. And so he felt the need to educate the public and also serve on the advisory committee for historical documentation of the State Department, which oversees the production of foreign relations in the United States diplomatic history. As we have to make sure there's access, the public has access, because the public it's sort of through the old progressive vision of the early 20th century. If the public has access, then they'll make better decisions. And if the public doesn't have access, that's the road to ruin. So,
do you have a sense of when he decided to get involved? As you said, he seemed to want to be a researcher and a teacher.
Yeah.
What was it that would make him say, okay, I'm going to step in and do certain things?
I think when the crisis got bad enough, I mean, I think like with he was head of the Historical Advisory Committee during the Nixon period, when things were very secretive, and he realized that was not a good way for the public to make a good foreign policy, or the educated public to make a good foreign policy. And I guess when a crisis got so bad and it looked like things were going to go from bad to worse, like in Central America in the early 1980s, I think he felt like he had to step in, because the U.S. had made so many bad decisions there previously, and so many self-interested, destructive decisions there previously, that now is the time to stand up and say something. Because if you didn't do it now, 20, 30 years later, you were going to regret not having done something. So that's a very good question, but I don't have a very good answer for it. It's basically when things come to a head, I guess.
When you leave graduate school, it's obviously a big step of, they're no longer your dissertation advisor.
Right, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your relationship then and how your relationship evolved through the years as you became a member of the profession in your own way?
Right. Well, I mean, he was someone who, even though he was very busy, had a lot of projects going at the same time, or he's doing his teaching and research, he always had time for his graduate students questions about, should I apply for this job, or how does a job interview work? Questions with regard to publication, and he was very good at helping me in that regard as well, because as you probably know, the publication world is difficult, hard to navigate, hard to get things out, and so he was very good about answering those questions by letter, email, even phone call. So he was always someone who said, just call me collect, even if you're overseas. I never did, but the point was, he's like, I'm always willing to talk to you about things that you need to know about professionally. So I don't know how he had all the time. Other people probably said this as well. How did he have the time to do all these things? But he did.
It was very striking to me. We've talked to so many people now that his students have gone in many different ways, right?
Yeah.
You've got professional policymakers, you've got archivists, you've got historians. What do you think it was about him that nurtured such a diverse set of, not ideologies also, but directions in life?
Yeah, I don't know. but I think he was very attuned to what was best for that individual. And so he had the remarkable ability to be able to, help the person achieve their goal. Like in my case, I wasn't going to be a great academic at an R1 school. Actually, I'm an R1 school now. Anyway, I wasn't going to be like someone who's going to publish these great works to change the field of diplomatic history. I didn't have that mind or that discipline. I was going to be more of a teaching college person. And so he mentored me in that way. And other people, they wanted to go into public service. So they wanted to go and become that great academic at, Ivy League, top-notch elite university. He could mentor that individual as well. So he managed to figure out, where he thought you should be and where you wanted to be. And he managed to sort of triangulate that really well. So I think he could mentor people in lots of different ways. And I guess it's just being very perceptive to what the person needs and wants, without him saying, I want you to do this. Because a lot of advisors, they have a vision for you. It could be their vision for themselves, and they just sort of impose that. And that's all they know. That's okay. It's not okay. That's understandable. But I think he realized that people were going to do lots of different things. So,
we heard from his daughter that one of the things that he always imparted to them was it's not just about mastery of one field, that you should be someone that is consuming all kinds of things. And I'm curious how you see his contribution, just beyond history, or how he just approached knowledge and thinking.
Right. When you say consuming all sorts of things, that's really important, because he read the news a lot. He was up on what's going on in the world. And so he never said this, but he signaled, like, if you're going to be a good historian, you have to know what is out there, what the public is reading, what the public wants. And because if you're going to write history that doesn't at all reflect what's going on in the real world, it's pointless, right? So I think that because he was so engaged in the news and the media, what's going on in the world, especially international relations, one realized that you had to be able to read lots of different things to understand this big thing, international relations. So,
in the course of this conference, we've heard from people that it's changed the way they thought about him, or they've learned new things about him that they didn't know. I'm curious if this is, there are things that this has reinforced for you, and things that you now look a little differently at. Right.
Yeah. Well, I started working on the tribute volume, or the Festschrift, 2 years ago and what was great was learning how he was so engaged with Cornell alumni, which I sort of knew, but there was letters that were saved and uploaded to a library, shared library. And so in writing our articles for the tribute volume, we had to get a sense of what made him tick, sort of why he wrote certain books, and how he responded to the critics. You had so that was like a treasure trove. So that for me was, I learned how he was so, I knew this before, but he was so gracious, that even if he was very critical of someone, he would hold back and not say it publicly. And he wouldn't become defensive about it, and he wouldn't sort of internalize it. And so that, working on this Festschrift really showed me how he was so successful, because if you get bogged down in disputes or conflicts and you get obsessed with certain ideas, or he didn't do that. And you could see that from the letters in his correspondence with a number of people that were made available to us. So that I guess was the most important thing I learned doing this. So,
do you have any memories of interactions with him that you want to share with us?
I guess just how he was so open and gracious after I left. I guess I sort of assumed, he was a very busy person, and when I was in graduate school, he had a number of grad students plus his other responsibilities. So he's very busy, often overseas and out of town. So I assumed he would be that way, for the foreseeable future, but he wasn't. He was very open and available to meet, whether in person or if I was in Ithaca. So just the fact that he was willing to invite me to his house, even with a graduate student who was giving a paper at Ithaca College or whatever, he was willing to meet, my spouse and family, and he could have very easily said, "No, sorry, I'm too busy," or "It's not going to work out." But he was very open and generous with his time, even up to the end. So.
Is there anything else that we didn't ask that you would like us to watch you for?
That's another great question. This has been very, very good. I mean, the questions have been great. I can't really think of anything at all because I think you really covered the ground really well. And I can tell by your questions that you've done a good job getting at the many sides of his personality and his talents. So.
Thanks so much, Jim.
Okay, thank you so much.